This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Samuel Levi Jones. Jones's work addresses the lack of African American representation in a variety of historical texts by deconstructing and reconstructing such books into large-scale canvases. In addition to painting and sculpture, Jones has been working to create a space for reconciliation, unity, and cross-cultural understanding in his childhood hometown of Marion, Indiana, which is still dealing with the impact of a lynching which occurred over 90 years ago. And now, a conversation about deconstructing and reconstructing with artist Samuel Levi Jones. Samuel Levi Jones, thank you for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Samuel, you have a show up right now at Galerie Lalonde in Paris, but you have your hands on lots of different things right now. Samuel, a lot of times with artists, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is, let's say you've sat down at a dinner party next to somebody who has absolutely no idea who you are or what you do. How do you start to describe your work to a perfect stranger?
I say most times I try to start from the point of thinking about my work in terms of the ideas that they're based upon. And, in the way which I describe myself as an artist, I tell people a lot of times that it wasn't a thing that I sort of aspired to do as a young person. Didn't start making until my mid-20s, if you will. And through a number of personal life experiences and sort of the way in which I see the world, that kind of brought me to making, if you will. And I think without all of that, I probably wouldn't have much interest in making. And I think that's definitely a starting point for me too. And I'd like to talk about in that way in which is important to me, aside from having discussions around, oh, you made it, or oh, I made it. To me, that's not so important.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of the conversation about art and craft. Just being a maker isn't quite as interesting as being the philosopher or the social commentator on what's lying underneath your work, right?
Exactly.
So it sounds like you probably had these thoughts and these opinions, and at some point there was a moment where you figured out that you could make. So was there a seminal moment there?
I think the moment was, I have two undergraduate degrees. One is in communication studies, and of course the second is in fine arts. And during my first studies, I took a photography class in my final semester, and I was just sort of naturally good at it. I had an interest in it, and traditional academics, if you will, was horrible at. I was never good at absorbing information and regurgitating it on a test. That was of no interest to me. Not that I didn't try and I didn't care, just I couldn't do it, if you will. It wasn't a strong point of mine. And when I took the photography class, a black and white photography film class, to be able to see my work and know exactly what I was submitting, if you will, in terms of the process, and being mindful of making a clean print, and knowing that if I did that for the most part, it was going to result in a positive mark, if you will. And then sort of in that instructor that I had, he asked me why I never considered being an artist. And I explained to him that I had very little exposure to the arts. I grew up in a small town in north central Indiana. So it was little exposure, and it wasn't until I started getting the exposure that I all of a sudden became interested. So, he said to me, you are better than most of my art students. And after that, I sort of decided that I wanted to pursue an art practice and worked a couple of different jobs from that point to the point of having the time to attend an undergraduate study program or art program, which was the Heron School of Art and Design here in Indianapolis. Uh, yeah, that was the point of which I dove in.
Well, it's a really interesting story because I think if someone were to look at your work, we wouldn't necessarily guess that your origins are in photography because we really don't see a lot of figuration. We don't see a lot of imagery. I mean, I feel like one of the keystone works for you did involve imagery. The 48 portraits underexposed, but for the most part, we don't see evidence of that photography origin in your work. And so, where did you find the confidence to get into that? Was it just based on the fact that this one person? And so often, you hear this in artist stories that there was this spark of identity and confidence that what, I think I'm an artist. Someone believes that I can be an artist. Was it just that much that gave you the confidence to start kind of seeing the world in a different way?
During my art undergraduate studies, when I was primarily working through the lens, I was actually working with a group that was a migrant worker group that traveled between Indiana and Texas, and I was, wanting to point out and address sort of the social issues that they were going through, and that was around the time of, I was in my art undergrad studies from 2006 to 2009, and here in Indianapolis, took notice of how Latino people were being profiled, being pulled over, pulled out of their cars, and it was a similar experience to sort of the Black experience in America, if you will. And then, before that, I was making work that was addressing sort of these personal experiences that I was going through, but it was very difficult for me to do, very emotional, and I had access to these, a different group of people who were going through a similar experience, but I was removed enough that I could process it and actually do the work. But also at the same time too, I the program that I was in and the instructor I was working with, fortunately enough, encouraged us to, work in other mediums. And, for example, I had this installation piece where I got a bumper, an old steel bumper from off of a car from a junkyard. And because I had made these bumper stickers that was sort of in response to a bumper sticker that I read that said something to the effect of, they were opposed to immigrants. And so I made all these sort of counter text on bumper stickers that were in opposition of that. And that was at a point in which I was thinking about material that was directly related to these ideas that I wanted to convey. And I think that for me, working strictly through the lens was a bit restrictive. And so that's sort of where the turning point came. And I've thought about, different moments in which I would maybe, pick up a camera again and work in that way. I think inevitably at some point, I'll return to that. Not entirely. I do like working in different ways for sure. But, in the last decade, this book material has definitely been the choice of, processing and expressing these ideas that I have.
For the listener that isn't well informed about your work, can you kind of help explain to them the nature of the deconstructing and reconstructing that you use in your work, and how when I look at work, it's really interesting in that your visuals lean on abstraction, but the meaning is in the materials. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You referenced earlier the 48 portraits underexposed. And that was the point at which I started working with books, because Gerhard Richter's 48 portraits, the source images were from the encyclopedia. And I thought, heck, I need to get a set of encyclopedia to investigate. And crazy enough, the very first set that I got was from the same year that he first showed those portraits in Venice, 1972. And that was enough for me. I knew, like, it told me that this was where that was where I needed to be. And it all made sense. And I think ever since that moment, I had no doubt that that was the path that I needed to be on. So that was how I started to working with the books, and I repurposed the pages from the books to make my own sheets of paper to print those portraits on. And then I continued working with the material and started breaking down the book covers. And so, yeah, I worked with the encyclopedias, and then soon after started working with law books. And so, when we think about the history of our smartphones, they haven't really been around that long. And I'd say around 2013 or so, when I started pooling or sourcing law books in response to the documented police brutality incidents that were happening. And so I was thinking about the issues, the problems of law and law enforcement, who law was written for, and in relationship to who it wasn't, written for, and the same with encyclopedias. Thinking about histories and narratives that were collected and composed, for people to learn from, and thinking about all the information, histories, and narratives that were intentionally left out. I've also worked with medical books addressing issues of medicine, particularly Western medicine, and I've worked not so much, but I've worked with art books as well, deconstructed art books, and sort of addressing issues of the canon and the lack of inclusion. So this material is really about addressing these power structures, and for me, the material is a stand-in for these power structures, and sort of get to, in a way, it's a cathartic way of dealing with the material and processing the ideas and the struggle, if you will. But as far as abstraction goes, I think it just sort of it's I never imagined that I would be working in an abstract way. But even though the work is abstract, the material, like you said, is very much related to the idea. And thinking back historically, it was a moment in time where you think about abstraction, just sort of this way in which you there's a deviation away from a practice or an art practice or art that pulls away from a deeper conscious, if you will. I think it's sort of commentary on that as well, even though that wasn't a direct intent of mine, but that's come up in conversations, and people have expressed how they have an appreciation for me working in this way, but also being very specific about the ideas that I'm talking about. So yeah, and I think, and then too, visually speaking, it's almost like an icebreaker. Mm-hmm. So it's a way to pull a viewer in, and then once they're there, I mean, they can escape if you want. I'm not going to hold them hostage, but there's an opportunity to talk about these difficult matters. Yeah, and I find the work to be very sort of fulfilling and working in a positive way.
Well, I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to an artist, and we've come to some sort of agreement that the best work is personal to the maker, often tied to place, issues related to one's identity, and so often specific to the geography of the artist's past. And when I say those words out loud, I think there's a direct correlation to your practice, right?
There definitely is a direct correlation. I think it is very personal, and but I also think too there's a relationship between sort of like my personal experience and maybe a universal experience, if you will, and but initially, it does come from that personal experience, but also um, a personal experience that many other people are sort of are experiencing, maybe not in the same way, maybe in a different way, in the way in which I experience explain the experience of Latino people in this country are there's similarities. So, and I think I in working with the medical books, I've worked to a way in which thinking about how people are more alike than they are different. And working with the medical books, that material isn't really discussed as much. And I guess now maybe an opportunity to talk about that material a little bit more. But the reason I've really enjoyed working with that material is because, as a human race, sort of being susceptible to all of the issues that are going on within medicine, and Western medicine as we know it, um, is not a long-standing practice. It's only been around for about 100 years. If people took a deep dive into that, and for example, I don't know if you're familiar with the Flexner report. Something I encourage people to look into and have a real understanding of how medicine has been monopolized and how it has been capitalized, in a very grotesque way. And I think, and I love working with that material because I'm thinking about sort of, even though I have my own personal experience versus, to be very specific, a black brown experiences versus a white experience. Like, okay, we have this experience in terms of like our human bodies, our health, and our existence, and thinking about how these systems are sort of, disrupting and sort of giving us the idea that they're in favor of it when actually they might not be. And so, how can we find these similarities and this common ground to, really come together, and get away from the way in which, you know, power structures or entities and those who have power use divisive methods to keep us from coming together.
That's it's really interesting because I mean these books promise comprehension and order of our world, right? But historically, they've been innately biased, and so often we talk about books, but I mean we're in a digital world, and we look at what's presented to us and what it's becoming harder and harder to discern what is truth and whose truth is it. Especially when you start talking about what are the forces behind our perceived truths. And it seems like in the 21st century, one of the core American qualities is greed and corporate greed. What motives do people have, that we don't even have visibility to? Not to sound like, a conspiracy theorist, but it's becoming harder and harder to discern what the truth is. And the thing is, we've never been given the whole story, and so it's like
Mm-hmm.
it's nice to slow down and take a step back and look at the history of not being given the whole story.
Yeah, it's so very true. It's the issues that are going on now within the region of Israel and Palestine is a point in case. We have to stop and sort of look at the history and look at the past, really gather information. And when you talk about technology too, we're also at a place, thinking about AI, and it's the technology to create sort of a visual and sound bites of something from someone that didn't even exist or didn't even actually come out of that person's mouth. It's all really scary. And the when you use the word discernment, and yeah, I think people are so quick to jump at whatever rather than absorbing or digging, researching, and gathering things from an individual standpoint versus like just repeating what they hear, what they see. And I think the things that I've always said too when I talk about my work is too, I try to encourage individuals to question, you know, question anything and everything. And I think that's one of the things that my practice, sort of being involved in the arts and being around other people who are involved in the arts, like um, I've come across individuals who just question things. But prior to that, that wasn't the case. Turn on the television, watch the news, and just sort of absorb it as facts. I'm like so far removed from that, from the early stages of my life. I'm like extremely grateful for that.
I feel like somewhere in the answer there, you were mentioning rush to judgment. That brings to mind this historic event that seems to keep on coming back up in your work because it's so tied to where you're from. In the work that you're doing with the Marion Legacy Project, specific to the lynching of J. Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith back in 1930. And when you read the stories of lynchings, it is always this rush to judgment. When we look at the story of someone like Emmett Till, right? Not a lynching, but just an equal atrocity. It was just such a rush to, and it's beyond human. Can you talk a little bit about this event as tied to again your geography, but also tied to our society, and how do we move towards reconciliation on something that is almost 100 years old but still has left scars in a community?
I think, we have to have the ability and the energy to really understand where all this originates from. And you talked about greed, and there's a correlation to that, because like this construct of race has been developed around free labor. And so, but to talk specifically about the project, the lynching happened in my hometown of Marion in 1930. Smith was a great uncle of mine, and I didn't learn about it until I was a sophomore in high school from a history teacher. And then after that, learning about that day in class, I went home and asked my father about it, and then he told me about it. And I was very concerned about, raised the question of why had I not originally learned it from him. And he just said, we don't talk about it. And that's how the town has historically dealt with it. It's just not been dealt with. There hasn't been any discourse around it. I think through recent years that has changed. So there's no public marker, there's no memorial, if you will. And I'm working on a public project to create a space for people to come together. It's actually sort of developing this space that's a courtyard into a garden, and collaborating with an artist by the name of Samuel Levi Jones, who grafts together different types of fruit trees. And that idea came from the relationship of strange fruit, which was recorded from the poem Bitter Fruit, that was written in response to that very event. So, thinking about that and thinking about having this tree, sort of implementing this tree that gives life versus the tree that took life. But yeah, I wanted to approach it in a very different way. And I didn't want it to sort of be this very didactic thing, this informative thing, but I wanted to create a space of transformation. But yeah, sort of, going back to, what I said earlier about the construct of race, and, creating this sort of hierarchy of people based upon pigment of their skin to create free labor. And, we have been duped in a way in which we don't really understand why that is. And we sort of, I think when conflict comes about or disagreement comes about, it's always sort of, talking about the details of it rather than really talking about the origins of the problem and dealing with the origin and trying to remedy that. You just even think about, poor white people in this country used as pawns to perpetuate that division. And a lot of times making decisions that are against their own interest. I mean, I think a lot of times in these, yeah, and that happens in so many different ways that we end up making things that are not in our best interest due to someone's greed.
So, can we talk a little bit about the garden that you're creating there, along with the tree? You're constructing, like, is it a wall, or is it kind of a curved space that is perforated steel that kind of emulates
Yeah, yeah.
the visuals of your typical body of work? How's the best way to describe it?
So the element of my work that will be incorporated, and I didn't, originally going to this, I hadn't really imagined having any visual part of my work in it, and through conversation, just sort of working with the architects, um, Daniel and Lulu, they're like, Sam, your work needs to somehow be involved in this. So we came up with this idea of having this wall that would be perforated in the aesthetic of my work, and that's backlit. And one in the relationship too, even though I have this personal relationship to the event itself, being that I'm from the town, and one of the victims being a family member, you know the fact that they were detained by law officials and they didn't receive due process, um and so they were accused of a crime. They were accused of murder and rape. Um, but that goes back to the correlation of that to my work, is like, I work with the law books, and that's the very thing that I'm talking about. Who benefits from the law and who doesn't, and you know there's a direct correlation. But yeah, so my work, there, through the wall will go through, sort of essentially be around the perimeter. I think of like 3 or 4 sides, the way in which we've designed it, 3 or 4 sides of the space. And then in the interior space, there will mostly be vegetation, and there will be sort of the one fruit tree, and then also 9 maple trees. And each tree, we're coming up on 2030. And the idea is that each tree represents each decade. And in a lot of ways, so there won't be much didactic, there won't be much text, there'll be some informative information. And some of the feedback that I've gotten is that it's a bit abstract, but that's okay. It is a space meant to, like I said, it's not so much tell people what to think or what to believe, but then invite them into a space, a safe place where they can, have questions and conversations.
Yeah, I had a guest on last year, a gentleman named Paul Farber, who's a head of an organization called Monument Lab, and they've done a lot of research around not only taking a survey of what monuments are out there, but also asking questions about why do we have monuments? What do monuments represent? And what is problematic about monuments that communities have inherited, in monuments that don't necessarily reflect a changing community, but also kind of going forward, like what are best practices in terms of how do you engage a community to create a monument that reflects the community. But at the end of the day, trying to come up with a definition for what a monument is. You ask 100 people what they think of as a monument, you're going to get all sorts of answers. It sounds like, as you describe it, you're hoping to have an attempt for someone to maybe not necessarily face the issue head on, but come to a place where they can ask questions and go through a process of self-discovery.
For sure. I think one of the things, a lot of times we sort of ask, as you stated, ask the question of what monuments should be, but, what about the question of what monuments shouldn't be? And so, I think that maybe that's even a more difficult question to answer. But yeah, I don't, it's tricky. And, I think historically, so, I don't know if you're familiar with this project that Fred Wilson proposed doing in Indianapolis. And it was a public piece that was going to be on a public trail. and he wanted to sort of reimagine a figure on a monument that already exists, and it's a slave figure, and he was going to sort of reimagine and the figure in a different light. And people on both sides, black and white, were in opposition to it for various reasons. And yeah, it's really interesting. I don't fully know what we've met with some community people. We have a stakeholder team, people from the community, and so far people are on board with it. And hopefully by this spring we'll be doing I think so. The exhibition that's up at the Chicago Architectural Biennial, we may relocate it to Marion and then have our, first broader public engagement. But I hope that, the community feels a sincere, attempt to create a situation, a space where there's healing. And I think that I'm going in the right direction, being that I grew up in the community, being that, as I described, my biggest disappointment with Fred Wilson was, and then that it didn't happen. I was thinking about my younger self who didn't have much exposure to the arts and, didn't go to museums. But if I stumbled upon something that was in a public space and I started to investigate and think about what it means, or like what art means or what it could be, and that's what I, imagine this to be. A place that's open to the public, and that, yeah, they come in and they don't, maybe there's a little bit of mystery and then they start to pick up on some elements here and there. But that they don't pick up on something, just like keep walking or ignore it, or that they're in opposition. Hopefully there's no strong opposition, or there's, and just the same, that there's some way in which an individual can kind of settle in the middle and absorb it.
I sense in your answer that this may not be your last public arts project.
I hope that it's not. I guess I don't have anything in mind, and I think that I think for all intents and purposes, if it is the first and last, I hope that it's successful. In the same way in which I've curated 2 art exhibitions. And I didn't do them for the sake of like, oh, there wasn't a box that I want to check off. I felt moved by an idea or responding to something, and I wanted to do that. So, for anything else that comes on in the future, I hope that I think, I'll definitely remain in the sort of a frame of mind where I'm doing things for that very reason, not just for the sake of doing it just to be doing it and sort of like building a CV, if you will, but it's really coming from a proper place.
So can we talk a little bit of nuts and bolts about your process? Because if somebody were to enter the gallery, they would look at your work and they may categorize your work as paintings, but I don't think is there any paint in your work? Because when I look at your work, there's where you've skinned the exterior of these cloth bound books, but then there are other works that they really kind of come across as being more color, and those appear to almost be made in a process that's like paper making, where you've absolutely destroyed the material to the point that you've got a colored pulp that you then wind up binding back together. I mean, is paint in your process? Am I understanding your work correctly?
You are understanding it correctly. And from the early phases of making the work, and it's changed over time. The process has changed, the aesthetic has changed a little bit. But when I was first making the works, or sort of making them from the book covers, I was aligning the covers as a full sheet, and it would appear as a perfect grid, if you will. Then I got to the point of cutting them up, overlaying them, and then using different books together. I use history books, medical books, or where I was first, it would just be that single book, if you will, in terms of it either being dictionary or encyclopedia, law books, medical books, and then I started mixing them together, the different types of books together. And then, about 3 or 4 years ago, I started pulping the book covers. But in terms of the use of the word paint, when people first saw my work, they asked me how I was applying the paint. They're physically standing there in front of the work. They're like, "How are you applying the paint?" And so I thought, shit, I'll just call them paintings. Um, but also at the same time, too, I was thinking about sort of like, and that's why, another reason of, the desire to use art books in terms of being coming from a critical standpoint. Because there's this hierarchy that exists, and paintings at the top, everything falls below it. So how do you disrupt that hierarchy, if you will? It's like you making a painting without actually using a paintbrush, if you will. And that's also in relationship to how we treat people. We want to create this hierarchy, and some people are more important than others. Um, but yeah, and then now I'm at this point to where I'm pulping the book covers. So the covers that you see essentially a color. If you see any given color, black is from a black cover, red is from red, and I mix in a medium to create texture and also maintain the color, if you will, because without that, it would a lot of times so black would dry like a gray color. Um, and it's weird how I've come to this point where in a lot of ways I'm making my own paint. Um, yeah, so there was no intention originally to say make the work and call it one thing or another, that I just kind of like stumbled into it, but also it all makes sense at the same time. In terms of like the um it leads back to this connection to, like, as I said, the social issues and creating a hierarchy and sort of the way in which power structures use that hierarchy to maintain their power.
But it's not just the two-dimensional flat objects either, because I saw an article the other day, one of these little bio pieces on Arthur Lewis, who's a huge collector and the creative director at UTA, and over his shoulder there was a sculpture of yours, right? I mean, you've gone beyond the 2D, and sculpture has, over the last couple of decades, risen in that hierarchy. How much of your practice do you contribute to three dimensions? Is that something that you think you'll add more to your practice as you go?
Yeah, I definitely want to push that element more. And in the last exhibition they had at Gallery Lalong, titled Conscious Intuition, I had several three-dimensional works in that exhibition. And I also had a space where I created a bit of a library with these um, individually cast books that were sort of sporadically placed on different bookshelves. And I wanted to get off the wall. And I think too, when I think about going from one exhibition to another, how much I'm changing, how much I'm pushing, but in particularly getting off the wall and creating a space where a person sort of is having an experience. And so with this sort of light, I kind of created a library, and I believe we used three bookshelves, um, and you kind of had to meander around. And that work was titled "The Library of Alexandria," that that relates to a library that burned down that had a lot of information, and there's still like it's funny every once in a while, and I can't remember the name of this library. People have sent me this huge library somewhere that has these um texts, like, and largely scrolls that are untranslated. um so thinking about information, sort of, when, as it's said, the victor gets to tell the story. Um and so, what about all these other stories that are sort of around that don't, you know that are not only not in books, but are also that are written, that are not shared. Um but yeah, I definitely want to get off the wall, and that's a whole lot of what this project is about in my hometown. And, getting to, and I think, truthfully, I think if it weren't for my practice in having a platform, I wouldn't have sort of, how would I say it? I think I would have, a less of an ability to be able to pull this off or be able to have a community to say, yes, you can do this. And so, um, I'm glad that I'm connected to this story. I'm glad that I can, contribute to it. Because at the end of the day, after, having so many shows and, thinking about what is it that my work is actually doing other than sort of having these transactional moments, you know, what can the work do beyond that? And I'll be thinking more about that as I go on, if you will. And yeah, maybe hopefully, it won't be my last public piece too. And it's sort of the first work in which, I'm working on is thinking like, and we spent a lot of time on this in the last few years. It's something I'm working on where I'm not thinking about, oh, like there's going to be some sort of transaction, I'm going to make money off of this, but thinking about how it relates to the community, how the community can benefit from it, and thinking about people like myself who are, coming up and growing in the community. And it's a small town, it's a town that has had a lot of sort of decay, if you will. A lot of industry has left. Um, and I don't really share this, but I'm thinking beyond this project itself, like the garden project, and what it may mean to be a catalyst for something else for the community.
No, it's interesting you brought up the library at Alexandria. I was watching this PBS program the other night. Henry Louis Gates has called Finding Your Roots, and he was talking with Billy Crudup. The show, it walks people through their unknown past of their genealogy, right? And Crudup was just kind of emotionally overwhelmed by everything that was kind of brought to him. And he was talking about a particular role that he had where he was mentoring this young girl, and she was so distraught over the idea that all of this content, all of this knowledge had been lost at the Library of Alexandria. And the way he was asked to console her was that knowledge, it may be lost, things can get dropped, but over time, things get picked back up. He felt like Gates had picked up things and had picked up knowledge, things of that could have been lost to history, and had presented it back to his family, that they had now reattained this knowledge. And in a lot of ways, I hear you aspiring to some of the same things, especially with this legacy project in Marion, that these are things that a community could aspire to lose and not acknowledge and hope it just goes away. But you've kind of picked up this rock and are asking people to reconsider.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fear wrapped around it. I think it's very and particularly interestingly, coming from the white community, I think people sort of have this fear that ancestors that they have will be outed and there is a connection and so on and so forth. I'm biracial, and I my mother, who's white, told me the story of how her father's father took him down to see the bodies hanging. He's probably like 6 years old, and from what I gather, he probably took him down and was like, this is how we treat people who look like this. That being said, I had only had one conversation with that man ever in my life, and he was, in opposition to my mother being with my father and didn't want to have any relationship with us. In ways, like I have, I come from, a lineage of people who are both victims and perpetrators, but ultimately, the entire community is a victim, if you will. And there's been conversations around how that event set the town on a different path in terms of the way in which it relates with one another. So yeah, I think it's important to sort of pick up these pieces and deal with the trauma that we've had within this country, that we've had, in this world, um, and really just get our shit together and really understand why all this was brought about. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it leads back to greed. And when you look at a lot of things, as they say, if you follow the money, you'll get some answers. Yeah. So we have to pick up the pieces and put it together.
Samuel, you have the work up right now at Galerie Lalonde in Paris. You have the reveal going on of the project at the architecture show in Chicago. If folks wanted to keep track of your career as you progress, if they wanted to keep an eye on you and engage with you, where's the best place to follow along? Is it a website or Instagram? Where should we send people to keep an eye on you?
Yeah, we've been doing a better job at keeping the website up to date, and also Instagram. I'm not a huge Instagram person, but we do our best to announce when things are happening. Yeah, I'd say that those two sources are probably would be the best way to keep up on things. Yeah, it's been a good year. The end of the year has been good. A lot of things are going on, but I'm really, really excited about this project in my hometown. And the architectural biennial, it's up through, I believe, around February. It's up for 3 months. It just opened like a week and a half ago. If folks are in town in Chicago, near the Art Institute, is where my work is installed at the Cultural Center on the ground floor. I encourage people to take the time to go see that, and really spread the word. Because that was like sort of our first public announcement of this project, and we haven't really dove deep into raising funds for the project, but I'm hoping I can get lots of support in that regard. And really excited about the project. The team did a great job in putting it together. It's a great presentation, and I just sort of, in a lot of ways, I can't believe that I'm working in this way. Initially, I was very sort of intimidated by sort of extending my practice and working in this capacity, but I've had the right people alongside of me, and that's made the greatest difference. So it's been a learning curve, but I'm very excited about it. So please check out the Biennial Project.
So hey, Samuel, I really appreciate your time today. I've loved our conversation, and I wish you the best of luck. I hope the work's well received in Paris and in Marion.
Thank you so much. It was good talking to you.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.